Hello and welcome to The Insider, a show designed to clue you into the biggest news, events, and announcements inside the video games industry, discussing with you some things you may know, some things you may not, and the glue that holds it all together is a little bit of my own opinion. My name is Paul James, thank you very much for watching, and let's get with our episode.
那么，让我们先去野外看看吧。
The Chinese market is rapidly growing in the video games industry. And just this past weekend, a little event called China Joy took place. And it's a growing event, just like the industry is. And we see lots of games coming out of China. There's obviously a Western presence because now we're finally allowing Western games and Japanese games into China. The industry is changing. China is starting to kind of take over little portions of companies. They're buying shares. They're buying China is becoming a big part of the video game landscape. And at China Joy on the weekend, a little game called Genshin Impact emerged. It was at the PlayStation stage. It was in their showcase. It was available on the show floor there. And it's ruffled the feathers of quite a few Zelda fans, of all people. In this week's episode of The Insider, we're going to dive into that topic. We're going to explore what's happened, why they're angry, whether they're right, wrong, or otherwise for that. And then we're going to explore where things are going to go from there. So let's get into it. So miHoYo is a Chinese-based developer and publisher, largely known for a bunch of mobile games that they've worked on over the course of the last decade. But they're developing a game called Genshin Impact. It's coming to the PlayStation platforms. They're not being specific, but it's fair to assume PS4 and possibly even PS5, maybe straddling console generations there. And it really ruffled the feathers of quite a few Zelda fans because in their eyes, it is straight up theft of Breath of the Wild. They're complaining about visuals, they're complaining about the music, they're complaining about gameplay, mechanics, anything you could possibly pick the teeth out of this game for, they're going for it. And what it resulted in on the show floor during China Joy was, firstly, some photos of one man who was so unhappy about this apparent theft that's going on that he threw his PlayStation on the ground and destroyed it, or a PlayStation on the ground, and destroyed it on the show floor in front of hundreds, thousands of queuing people that are there to see different games and whatever, they enjoy their time. He's smashing his PlayStation on the ground in front of him. And then you've got a whole bunch of other Switch owners, which confused me somewhat because I don't know that the Switch is still available yet in China. So they've imported it. But anyway, several Switch owners, they're there with their copies of Zelda Breath of the Wild or their Switch with Breath of the Wild in it and playing and running. And they're standing there in front of this giant Genshin Impact poster and marketing work and flipping the big poster off whilst holding their copy of Zelda in a protest of sorts against what miHoYo have done. Next, we're going to talk about whether this game is in fact some form of theft or just copying or whatever, and then we'll go from there. Is Genshin Impact theft? Well, we need to really dive into this thing because there's lots of different components of the game. Firstly, if we look at it just genre by genre, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a third-person action open world game. And I've kind of twisted those in terms of how they're normally pronounced, but whatever. Then you look at Genshin Impact, which shares certainly a lot of different qualities, but its core, it is a third-person, action-based JRPG. The JRPG thing is a really important distinction, and we'll get to that shortly. But let's start with the thing that's really ruffled the feathers the most. The visuals and the music. There are a lot of similarities in the music, but people's tastes, the way people kind of consume music, that's going to differ. So we won't dive too much into that. It's very hard for me to demonstrate it in this format. But the visuals is something we can certainly discuss in great depth. Graphically, there are a lot of similarities in some respects. Genshin Impact has an open world, an open field, very similar to what we see in Breath of the Wild. Visually, it looks very, very similar. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that some people watching this episode will sit back and be unsure at different points as to whether I'm showing you Breath of the Wild footage or whether I'm showing you Genshin Impact footage. I'll leave you to work that out. I'm sure you probably can, but it's feasible for that to be a thing because there are a lot of similarities here, from the field itself to the water and the way it animates and looks. Some of the enemies, they're shooting the lasers just like what we see in Breath of the Wild. And even the lasers themselves look very similar to Breath of the Wild. Visually, aesthetically, there are a lot of things very similar when it comes to these two games. But then where they begin to differ is in terms of the world itself. We know Breath of the Wild to be an open world, but it doesn't really have any big hubs or cities of any sort. There's certainly some small little villages and little gatherings of a couple little huts or whatever the case may be, but we're not talking sprawling cities or anything like that. And Genshin Impact appears, based on some of the trailers and footage available, to have that. Then when we look at the mechanics, there are more JRPG systems present in this thing than what we get in Breath of the Wild. And that's a pure product of what these two different games are going for. And it will, I think, in time, as we see more about the game, I think that'll be revealed and become more and more apparent in time. That yes, there are a lot of visual similarities, and maybe enough for Nintendo to act, and we'll talk about that shortly. But in terms of what these games are, how they play, what we'll be doing to experience those games, in terms of what's going on in our hands, we'll be playing these games quite differently. I had to get a little bit of a laugh out of this whole thing. I couldn't help it. The Chinese, I just sit back and I think pot meet kettle, the whole calling the kettle black sort of situation. The Chinese market for decades, because of the bans on video games in their country, have basically been producing knockoffs of several big Japanese and other Western IP for decades now. There's been blatant asset theft, and it's just not been worth it for these companies to go and pursue these Chinese developers because of the nature of the politics behind the whole thing here. So for all of a sudden people to get really up in arms over Zelda, and I understand there's Zelda almost works to a different set of rules than most other game franchises, and the fans seem to operate on a different level to what we see from a lot of other franchises. But for Zelda, like for this particular game to be the one that suddenly their own Chinese market is up in arms about it, just doesn't make a lot of sense, because this has been occurring for decades now. And maybe it's only a product of that now readily accessible Western Japanese influence in the gaming space. Are people now starting to connect the dots? And that's the only real rationale I can maybe glean from this. But then you contrast that response and the smashed PS4s and people flipping off the posters to the response from the West, and it's very, very different. In the West, we've gotten very used to knockoffs or clones or ideas being kind of pulled from games and drawn into them. We've got the likes of Darksiders, which I love, and it pulls from Zelda, it pulls from Portal, it pulls from a whole bunch of different franchises, puts it all together in one package, and we love it. Oceanhorn is another example of that. The first Oceanhorn was, in many ways, like just a theft of a 2D top-down sort of Zelda, and we love it. And there's a lot of hype for the upcoming sequel to that game. And there's so many other examples involving Zelda out there. And yet, the Western market doesn't really mind. We kind of sit back and go, great, like, I'm getting another chance to experience this form of this franchise that I absolutely adore. We get excited by that, and we jump at these sort of opportunities. And that's the way we kind of consume this, and we perceive these sort of differences or similarities is very, very different from location to location, clearly. What I will be interested to see is how Nintendo responds and how this game actually performs when it does finally release in the West. Because I would suggest, and again, the Chinese market is a small one. It is a growing one. It's a rapidly growing one, but it is a very small one. I'd be very curious to see how the game sells out here, because I would suggest that the majority of us, 99.9% of gamers out there, would have had no idea what Genshin Impact was, who MiHoYo was, what China Joy even was, until this past weekend. But all of a sudden, when the Legend of Zelda name's attached to it, it's given a lot of attention to this game, and you would think that in turn, that's going to warrant a few more sales. I'm certainly interested. I'm now certainly watching it, and I would not have been familiar with this game unless PlayStation decided to pop it up at a PSX or at an E3 or in a State of Play or whatever the case may be, somewhere down the line. I doubt I would have known about it. I doubt you would have known about it. But now we're all watching it very carefully. It's meant to come out in 2020 sometime, presumably for the West as well. I'll be curious to see how things play out. So that concludes this week's episode of The Insider. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. All those buttons are down the bottom here, and hit that notification bell That way you're alerted to every new video the moment it pops up on the channel. That includes Patched, The Insider, Player 2 Plays, Late Game Review, Gamer School, Lazy Gaming, and a whole bunch more. There's some awesome stuff. Again, hit that subscribe button and be ready for everything the moment they drop. Visit the website, player2.net.au, where you'll find reviews, previews, opinion pieces, news, features, the Player 2 Writers Draft, links to our podcast series, Dev Diary, and the Player 2 Pixelcast/podcast. Go and check all those out. Subscribe to the podcast. Visit the Twitch channel, twitch.tv/player2au. We've got several weekly streams going on these days. It's growing fast. Jump on board, be a part of the whole family, and really enjoy some awesome games that are being showcased every single week. We're on Patreon, patreon.com/player2au, kicking a few bucks. At the lower tiers, you'll get early access to episodes. The higher tiers, you'll get monthly episode exclusives. Finally, there's Twitter. You can find me at Paul James Games. The website you'll find at player2au. And until next time, that's been Genshin Impact, MiHoYo, Legend of Zelda, Apparent Theft. Thank you very much for watching. Watch that space. I'll see you next time.